This content is not suitable for children and may contain depictions of violence.
Hi Islanders, grab a beer and pull up a deck chair. This is True Crime Island, another true crime podcast. I hope you're all doing well. And this week, let's get stuck straight into it. Now, when judges ponder over sentencing young offenders, they do take their youth into account, even for the most heinous of crimes. The problem is, even with a long sentence, these criminals can get out when relatively young, and some will go on to repeat their crimes. Now, this week is the carbon copy killer, Barry Gordon Hadlow. Now, a bit of a trigger warning, as this episode does involve the murder of two little girls. Now, tonight, I will reference Paul B. Kidd's book, Never to Be Released. Now, you may remember me referencing this book several times, and I really recommend you go out and have a look at this. It goes over many crimes in Australia in reasonable depth, and more than I can do here. Now, Paul is a great true crime author, and it's easy enough to get on Google Books or Kindle. I also reference the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, the Canberra Times, and the Western Star. And thanks to my Patreon and PayPal contributors for my newspapers.com subscription. And also big thanks to Dion for sending me some court records the other day. So first, we go way back in time to the 60s, the 24th of November 1962 to be precise. Now back in the day, and even back in my day, which isn't quite that far back, kids, even toddlers, would be in the front yards of houses playing. The older ones would go to the local shop for mum or dad to buy smokes, milk, bread, lollies, whatever. And it was no big deal. It wasn't really seen as this high-risk thing. Now, sure, there were predators around just like today. But rather than security cameras, most families were single income. Usually dad went to work and mum stayed at home. And when the kids got a bit older, maybe mum went and got some part-time work. This was pretty much the norm back then. And because there were so many people at home during the day, there were a lot of eyes rather than security cameras keeping an eye on things. So those predators that may have been in the community had to be very careful if they tried to prey on young kids. Also, the population wasn't that high back in suburban Australia back then, so statistically there were less predators around. Now, I guess another thing that was that people tended to know each other in the community a lot more. I feel we're a little bit more isolated nowadays, even though we're better connected than ever before. Now, back then, if there was someone who wasn't quite right or a little bit creepy, it would get around. So this sense of safety wasn't that there weren't predators around. It came about more from the way the community had evolved. Anyway, let's get back to the 24th of November 1962, South Townsville in F&Q or Far North Queensland. Here the Bacon family lived in Tully Street near the port of Townsville, and that was north of the Ross River. Now, Don Bradman Bacon, his wife Eunice and their 5 kids lived in the typical working class suburban house. The Bacon family had plenty of rellos living close by, and they would often get together on the weekends. Now, 5-year-old Sandra Bacon was the second youngest of the kids, or maybe the youngest. I can't be certain because Paul Kidd's got 2 books, and in one he says she's the second youngest, but in his other book, and that was Australia's Serial Killers, he says that she is the youngest. Anyway, she's only 5 years old. And on this lovely Saturday morning, her grandma was preparing a family lunch, and Sandra was asked to go and get her sister. Now, Sandra went down the street to Archer Street that formed a T-junction at the end of Tully Street. Now, it's here The 20-year-old labourer Barry Gordon Hadlow was sitting on his front veranda. Now, Hadlow had experienced a difficult childhood. He was overweight and stupid. At school, he was a bully and was hated upon by students and teachers alike. Now, because of his troublemaking, he was shifted from school to school, with the teachers quite happy to see him moved on. When he saw little 5-year-old Sandra approaching, he called out to her. Now, Sandra told him that she was looking for a sister, and he replied, "Well, when you find her, could you give her these?" And he then held up some comic books. He then told her to come inside with him, as he had more comics inside. Now, Sandra followed him into the house, and straight away Hadlow pounced. He stripped off her clothes, he lay her on his bed, and he held his hand over her mouth to stop her from screaming. He then sexually assaulted her, but Sandra kept screaming. Hadlow then wrapped his hands around her throat, pushing his thumbs in deep to try and block her windpipe. Now, Sandra fought as hard as a 5-year-old could. She tried to stay alive. When Hadlow tried as hard as he could to kill her but she wouldn't die, he picked up a hunting knife that was next to his bed and stabbed Sandra through the heart. Now, when Sandra failed to return from looking for her sister, the family called around to all the places she usually may have gone, or they thought she may have been, but they couldn't find her. She'd last been seen at around 4:30 p.m. At 7 p.m, with no sign of Sandra, the police were called, and in no time there were 300-odd people out searching for her. At one stage, Hadlow approached David Bacon, and I think he was an uncle, and tried to console him. Hadlow said, "I can sympathise with you. Once my brother went missing for 4 days. He then said that maybe she'd fallen in the river and been eaten by sharks, or that she'd been snatched by a childless couple." He then said, and this would be weird in the moment, it'd be weird at any time, it's quite an awkward thing to say, he said maybe Sandra had been murdered and her body hidden in the boot of a car. Now, this would prove to be spot on the money. Hadlow, after murdering Sandra, put her body in a bag, or more like a sack, and left it in the boot of a car parked outside his place. She would be found there 2 days later. Now, Hadlow had fled at this stage, but he didn't get far. And friends of Hadlow had been told where he was going, and police picked him up pretty quickly. He said to them, "Where have you been? I've been expecting you." And, "Yeah, I killed her." On the way back to the police station in the back of the car, Hadlow complained that his thumbs were sore from pressing on Sandra's neck. I mean, he would confess to police that he sat in the bed wondering what to do with her. She was out of it, but not dead. He said, "So I got my Bowie knife and stabbed her in the heart to finish her off." He then hid her body in the boot of the car, and get this, he then took some of the local kids to the movies. I mean, this pretty much freaked out the whole community of Townsville at the time. I mean, nothing at all like this had happened before. I mean, parents started to keep a closer eye on their kids, and not like shit like this had never happened before anywhere, I mean, we've got nursery rhymes and children's stories from hundreds of years ago that were used to frighten kids and make them aware that not all is good in the world. I mean, I suppose we call that stranger danger now. At his trial in 1963, he would be found guilty and sentenced to life. Now, the law at the time would let Hadlow apply for parole after 13 years. Now, after quite a rocky start to his sentence, where other prisoners would abuse him, as you can imagine, it all seemed to settle down, and he became a Christian and followed all the rules. Now, after 22 and a half years, Hadlow was granted parole and released in 1985. So by my reckoning, he would have only been about 44 years old. Now, he would meet and marry mother of 8, Leonie Moody, and they would get married. Now, Leonie was aware that he had murdered someone, but whether or not she knew it was a 5-year-old girl is disputed. Now, she reckoned she didn't know, but one of her daughters, Sherelle Moody, says the opposite, that her mother was well aware of the fact that he murdered a 5-year-old little girl. I believe Sherelle. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, in 1990, Hadlow and Leonie, plus 4 of her daughters, were living in Roma, and that's about 400 kilometres northwest of Brisbane, where 9-year-old Stacey-Ann Tracy went missing on her way to school on the 22nd of May. On the morning of the 22nd of May, Stacey-Ann left the Queen's Arms Hotel where her family was staying, and she left with her younger sister, 7-year-old Elizabeth, to go to the Roma Middle School. She dropped her sister at the Junior State School in Bowen Street and continued on, turning into Cottle Street where she was last seen alive. She did not arrive at school. Now, when it was realised Stacey-Ann was missing, police were called in and a search was underway. Now, Barry Hadlow again volunteered to help search for her. Now get this, he goes up to police and tells them that Stacey-Ann was unhappy with her home life and that she intended to run away from her stepfather. I mean, what the fuckity fuck? Now, locals who knew of Hadlow, they tipped police off that he should be looked at closely, and after doing a bit of a background check on him, they kept him under surveillance. Now, on the 25th of May, her school bag and umbrella were found at bushland just off Surat Road in the general area of the intersection with the Warrego Highway. Now, later that day, a plastic garbage bag was found on the banks of Bungle Creek, and that was close to the old Surat Road, the same place, very, very close. The bag contained a green pillow and some sheets. A body was found on 26th of May 1990 in bushland off Miss Campbell Street on the banks of the Bungle Creek, and that's east of Roma. She was wrapped in a plastic rubbish bag from the waist down and was still dressed in her school uniform. She died of strangulation and suffocation. A rope was knotted around her neck and her pants were forced down her throat. She had been sexually assaulted. Hadlow would be questioned on the afternoon of the 29th of May and later that night be charged with murder, deprivation of liberty, child stealing and indecent assault. Now, I'll just go over some of the evidence that investigators were able to find. Now, on Stacey-Ann's body was a torn piece of paper. Maybe it had been in the rubbish bag she was wrapped in. And when police searched Hadlow's place, they found the other part of this torn paper. Now, the page was identified as being in the handwriting of Hadlow's wife, Leonie, and related to dart scores of a social darts game played during the time when Hadlow and his family resided in Toowoomba. Now, witnesses had seen Hadlow in the areas where her belongings and the bag containing the pillow and bedsheets were found. The sheets found in the garbage bag were identified by Sherelle Moody, the stepdaughter of Hadlow, as sheets which she had purchased in 1986 in Longreach. Now, at that time, she was working on a station called Tarcombe. Now, she said that she took the sheets to the Hadlow's home in Toowoomba in 1987, when he and his wife were residing there before moving to Roma. The sheets, she said, were left at the Toowoomba place, and she saw them in Roma in the linen closet at Hadlow's place in Charles Street. Now, there was medical evidence that vomit was found on the sheets, and vomit was also found in the esophagus of Stacey-Ann. Now, in statements to the police, Leonie, Hadlow's wife, identified the sheets as coming from her household. Now, she repeated this during the committal hearings, and at the trial, though, she denied that she'd seen the sheets before. I mean, what a lying bitch. Hostile witness. Now, Hadlow knew Stacey-Ann and her sister, as on the morning of the 22nd of May, it was raining, and he drove some kids who lived next door to him to school. Now, they were friends of Stacey-Ann, and Hadlow stopped off at the Queen's Arms Hotel to see if they wanted a lift, but they'd already left for school. So Hadlow knew Stacey-Ann was on her way to school. He's probably dropped the kids off from next door and then saw Stacey-Ann walking in the rain. He pulls over and she gets in the car. Now, she's probably seen Hadlow around quite often, so probably didn't see him as a threat at all. Now, hold on to your rage here, people. So we can be sure that Hadlow has, at this point, lured Stacey-Ann into his car and he drives home. Now, there's no witnesses to seeing Stacey-Ann going into his house, so she may have done it willingly at this point. Maybe as he's promised her something, whatever, I don't know. But shortly after, there is a witness that sees something which I would call alarming. It is from a Mr. Quinlan that lived at 14 Queen Street, next door to Hadlow. He told investigators that he returned home at about 8:30am after taking his son to Roma Middle School, and while having a cup of tea, he heard loud noises coming from the flat next door. Now, he said he was standing at the kitchen bench gazing out the back window when he saw a young girl run away from the back of the flat, closely followed by a person who he believed was Hadlow. Now, the girl was grabbed on the shoulder by the man and pulled backwards towards the flat. Now, Mr. Quinlan did not see either of them after that, but he did describe the girl as about the same age and size as his son, who'd just turned 9 and was not particularly tall. Now, I reckon he must be describing Stacey-Ann. So, did Stacey-Ann try to flee once she realised what Hadlow's intentions were? Now, why didn't Quinlan go and find out what was going on or call police? I mean, now, I don't want to throw Quinlan under the bus for this, but when he saw the girl run out the back and then grabbed by Hadlow, maybe it just didn't look to him to be that much of a big deal. Maybe he just thought it was a father bringing in his kid, as Hadlow was living at the house with his wife and 4 of her children. Now, his stepkids were probably at school at the time. Now, thing is, where was his wife? I mean, Hadlow would be convicted of murder and jailed for life. At the end of the trial, Hadlow yelled out towards the judge, "It's the greatest travesty of justice since Christ was crucified on the cross. He was crucified with lies too. You couldn't lie straight in a bed, you bastard." And to the police and warders present, he shouted, "They'll get theirs, lying dogs. Their lies will bring them down." Now, a couple of disturbing things would come out of this trial. Now, because Hadlow's previous conviction for murdering Sandra Bacon could not be brought up in court, neither could the psychiatric report they did on him at the time. It said that further sex crimes would occur if Hadlow were not kept in a safe place, and that means prison. The doctor said that there was no treatment for his condition, but now the psychiatric reports that were presented at his parole hearing, they basically said the opposite. They detailed that Hadlow was probably immature with some schizoid feature when he raped and murdered 5-year-old Sandra Bacon. Now, they claimed it was unlikely Hadlow would be any trouble in the future. A prison chaplain wrote in 1984, when Hadlow applied for work release, that he'd become a Christian and partakes in church and Bible studies, and that he's a wiser and sadder man. I mean, what the fucking fuck is this guy on about? He raped and murdered a 5-year-old girl. But the judge in the second trial said that he recommended that Hadlow never be released from jail, and he slammed prison authorities for releasing him in 1985. He said to Hadlow at the end of the trial, and I'll quote, "It is quite apparent that a dreadful mistake was made in releasing you from prison in 1985. Your case is a salutary reminder for those members of the community who believe that convicted persons should not be kept in custody. From what I read in the press and see and hear of discussions on the radio and on the TV, some members of the community seem to think that instead of sentencing, that you were safe to be released. But I suspect that probably one of your weaknesses is small girls, and despite having given the impression that you are a model prisoner, it would be fair to say that as small girls are not in prison, any weakness you had was not going to be exposed. I just cannot understand how anyone who had the opportunity of seeing the psychiatric report following the Townsville murder could ever have allowed you to be released in 1985. It is my recommendation that you never be released." Now also, Sherelle Moody, Hadlow's stepdaughter and Leonie Hadlow's daughter at the time, was scathing of her mother in the way she stood by him. Now, Sherelle is an award-winning journalist and has since created the Red Heart Campaign. Now, the Red Heart Campaign commemorates all lives lost to murder and manslaughter while working to end all forms of violence, including domestic and family abuse, rape and sexual violence, and neglect. Now please check it out on Facebook. That's the Red Heart Campaign. Now Sherelle wrote in a piece in the Western Star in 2018, and I'll read this little bit out. My mother married Barry Gordon Hadlow despite knowing he was on parole for killing 5-year-old Sandra Dorothy Bacon in Townsville. My mother had 4 young daughters living in her Townsville household when Hadlow moved in. A few years later, he killed 9-year-old Stacey-Ann Tracy in Roma, and my mother chose to stand by his side. She refused to speak to police when they came knocking on the door. She watched as Hadlow helped the local community search for the child. She stood up for him when he was arrested and charged. She gave interviews defending him. Now, Leonie Hadlow said, "My husband is innocent. He wouldn't hurt anyone. I trusted him more than anyone else in the world, and I still do. I mean, fuck's sake. Are some people in denial or what?" Now, that piece was written by Sherelle because of the way Julian Thorburn stood back and did nothing, protecting her husband and son after the rape and murder of 12-year-old Tia Lee Palmer, who was in their foster care. Now, that's a case I have covered on my audio podcast before. Now, I did reach out to Sherelle very, very late in my research, only Saturday in fact, and at the time of writing, she'd not got back to me. So there may be an update to this episode in the near future. So there you go, Islanders. Hadlow nothing but maggot scum. He rapes and murders a 5-year-old girl, helps in searching for her, approaches police with his theories on what happened, but he's dumped a body in a sack in the boot of a car and then he tries to run off. He gets caught, becomes a Christian and plays a good guy and gets out at only 44 years of age, even though psychiatrist reports say he's going to do it again if he's released, as there's no treatment for his perversion. They let him out. They actually do let him out. And a few years later, he does a carbon copy kill. He rapes and murders 9-year-old Stacey-Ann Tracy. He dumps a body in the bush and again helps police search for her and gives him his wild theories on where she was. But then he protests his innocence even though all the evidence points to him being the perpetrator. I mean, there's no remorse. So we as a society should treat him the same. He should never have been released in the first place. And no one that commits such a crime, especially against someone so young, I mean, they should never expect any right to be part of society again. I mean, fuck it. If some half-wit psychiatrist or psychologist says he's rehabilitated, fuck it, lock the maggot away forever in general prison population, not this protective custody bullshit. I mean, fuck him and anyone else who stands by these monsters. As I say, I hope the karma bus does the boom fuckalunga on this asshole straight to hell. And that's where Hadlow went in 2007, to the relief of many. So that's the end of the show. Now, if you want to support the island, there are links in the description for Patreon, PayPal and merch. Please feel free to comment, like and subscribe. And I would truly appreciate it if you share the channel. Now, hit the bell if you want to be notified of upcoming episodes. Usually every week. I may, like I did last week, have to miss one. Because I don't bleep out the swearing and use words like murder, the YouTube gods won't promote the channel for me. So I'm relying on your subscription and sharing. It truly is appreciated. And just to help more people see the island. Now, I will be running a 1,000 subscriber giveaway. So if you've listened this far, you could probably win a t-shirt and it will be open to all subscribers. So tell your mates, get in there and have a look. Well, that's it. I've been your host, Cambo. You've been watching True Crime Island. As I always say, don't forget to delete your browser history. Good night and boom, fuckalunga.